Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that thinks you're very special people, that you should go home and to remember that we love you. And how are you, Rob?
Oh, very well, thank you. How are you?
All right. We've just done our pre-show. I think we spoke a bit about vaccines. I should be getting mine tomorrow, which is kind of interesting. So that's cool. But otherwise, staying at home, doing all the lockdown things as we're supposed to. How's lockdown 3 for you?
I'm fine. I'm 5 banana breads in. I've watched Tiger King 3 times. I think I'm doing it right this time. Yeah,
just going through the classics.
It feels like a weird lockdown this time round. I was discussing it with my wife earlier. Just that the previous lockdown, it was kind of like it was always getting lighter and a bit sunny. And when I got overwhelmed, I could go outside and breathe for a bit. At the moment, it's like, oh great, I get up in the dark, I work. It's dark outside already. It's January, which is kind of miserable anyway. It's a bad time to be locked down, really. But as you said, brighter things on the horizon. We can look forward to vaccines and maybe a possible end to this in the near future. Fingers crossed.
Speaking of things for which there is not as much of an end in sight as we may have hoped, in our headlines, in The Independent, vague Brexit deal fails to give clarity to business.
Yeah, I just wanted to. We'll probably go into this in a bit more depth once the full effects of the Brexit deal have all sort of filtered through. But I just wanted to touch on the point that, it is our first official podcast, I guess, after the Brexit deal is in effect, and we are starting to see some of the consequences of that in various different forms. I think the biggest one this week has been the effect on the ports in particular.
Yeah.
And we've had Michael Gove on telly telling us that there will be significant disruption at the ports this week. There are reports of certain supermarkets running out of certain fresh fruit and vegetables, things that are quite time sensitive, have to go through the ports quickly, and if they don't, they can basically get to the supermarket. They're already past their sell-by date. They have to be thrown away. So it certainly seems to be getting a lot of challenges for business, and particularly what this headline suggests. I know that there have been a lot of businesses who thought they had all of their rules sorted for how to deal with both Europe and Northern Ireland, and it's all been turned on their head because the Brexit deal interprets them in a slightly different way. Certainly that will be one of the effects of agreeing a deal so late. Businesses didn't quite have the time to prepare that you'd want them to. Even though obviously the government has been having a big campaign promoting it, saying changes are coming no matter what on January 1st, you need to get ready. The minutiae of those changes was never really spelled out by the government, and now we've got a definitive set of rules. It's throwing up all sort of crazy things. I think the one that hit the headlines today was a lorry driver going into Holland who had to throw away his ham sandwiches.
It was a Dutch customs with it was a variety of people coming in with their sandwiches, and they're like, saying welcome to Brexit to people who were having to travel across. And I've also heard from friends of mine stories about I know some people whose parents live in France and are French citizens, and so they're able to travel to France despite everything going on, but a lot of people being turned away. There's a muddying of the story by what's going on with Brexit with what's going on with COVID as well, because the borders were closed down because of COVID as well. So it's like some of these stories, you have to make sure you're 100% certain it is a Brexit story and not a COVID story.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is sort of being. I believe if COVID wasn't going on right now, I believe that the impacts of Brexit would be the top story at the moment. Is my impression,
definitely.
Yeah. But as we'll see in our next set of headlines, COVID. Maybe there's a good reason why that's taking the limelight at the moment.
Yeah, well, speaking of our next headline from the Daily Mail, are we heading for the 3 meters rule?
Yeah, so as you may have noticed, we're in a lockdown, and we're really starting to see the impact of this new variant on the country, on hospital admissions, and that in turn is putting a massive strain on the NHS. I believe we've had multiple breaking headlines of hospital admissions going up. And in particular, I know that London, was it a state of, I don't want to say state of emergency. What do they
two things happened on the same day. So the hospital that I work at declared a critical incident, which is a hospital level thing, where they basically are like, we can't deliver certain elective surgeries, stuff like that, because it's not safe to come in unless you're really, really dying. And then the other thing that happened was, I think it was a severe incident was declared for London by the mayor, which is just, again, it's a bureaucratic thing, but on a citywide level, that this is bad, certain things need to change, etc. But it doesn't really mean anything to the average person. It's just kind of it allows them to open up emergency funds that they may have lying around and things like that to deal with an incident. I think it might allow them to put police on a different footing. I don't know the ins and outs of everything, but essentially it's a bureaucratic switch over in how things are being approached.
Yeah, they've ramped things up in the capital, and I do think this is maybe the first time in particular within like our COVID lockdowns that it's particularly affected London and a massive, like, affected the capital so much. Because obviously before then, all the major lockdowns were happening up in the north, but the new variant seems to have taken hold, particularly in the southeast first. And of course, you've got a lot of pressure and a lot of people in the southeast. I think it was tonight on the Daily Briefing, they were talking about opening up the Nightingale hospitals for non-COVID ICU patients, because the problem that we're facing now is the one that we feared when we first went back into a lockdown, like back in April of last year, whenever it was. The problem is that COVID patients, as they come in, they fill up your critical care beds. So that means if there's a car crash and somebody wants to try and find a bed, they can't find it because it's full up of COVID patients. So even if the rest of the hospital or those services are like not impacted as much, you still need critical care capacity, and that's where London, I think, at the moment is starting to struggle. But I certainly know of other trusts around the country that are, having to divert patients to other trusts because their beds are filling up, etc. So we're getting to, I think it's fair to say, I think in the words of Christopher Whitty, wasn't it, this morning, saying that this is probably going to be the worst time for COVID in the UK, and it's coming at an odd time because we've got the mass vaccination program is happening in tandem with it, which is clearly one of the big paths to getting out of this crisis. And there's a growing call on the government to maybe offer vaccinations 24-hour, like on a 24-hour rolling timescale to get as many people through as quickly as possible. And I certainly think that, I agree, getting vaccinated or getting as many people as vaccinated as possible is the only way out of this crisis. But it's a massive undertaking, and the logistics behind that, I can't even begin to imagine what challenges that has for emergency planners and the like. So, yeah, big challenge for the government on its hands on multiple fronts. It's just about sort of holding the line now and hoping that we get through this lockdown and see where we are at the end of it.
And I think it's as the famous quote, isn't there, that it's darkest before the dawn. This is very much like we know there is the hope in sight of a vaccine. Think how horrible it would be to be here without that, kind of sat there as a kind of release valve for our worries. So yes, it's awful right now. You have to follow all the rules, and that's the situation we're in. Hopefully we will start to see the effect. I think they were saying it was about 1.5 million people have been vaccinated, though don't quote me on that exact number. I'm trying to remember something someone said to me offhand the other day. So that's what, 1/70th of the population. But again, it's ramping up. We've got more vaccines coming online. There's another vaccine that will start to get early spring. My understanding is that nearly all frontline workers have been vaccinated. People in the top age bracket and very vulnerable people have been mostly vaccinated. And now it's more kind of getting out to those places that are a bit harder to reach for people who couldn't, say, get into a hospital to have their jab. And then it's also starting to bring the ages down and work through the older population and people who are less vulnerable. And kind of as we said in the pre-show, that people who are working on NHS properties, regardless of whether they're frontline or not, are now getting the vaccine as well, including ourselves. Yeah, it's rolling out, but the vaccine takes several weeks to kick in, and then with the first dose, it's not fully effective, and you have to wait for the second dose to get up to like 90% effectiveness. So it's not a quick fix. It's a thing we will hopefully start to see the positive effect of, but right now the numbers are just going up, and because of that 2-week delay, it's gonna be not fun for about a month or so, I would imagine, at least. And it sounds like our lockdown is going to be until February sometime, they said. So, yeah, it seems at least the government understands that bit now, which is good. But I feel, I think it's better that we're kind of stuck with this, knowing what it is for a bit of time, and they'll slowly remove things as they can. But I think people had started to get a bit lax with it overall, and especially kind of running up to Christmas. It's amazing the kind of difference in conversation we're having a few weeks later.
Yeah, totally. Looking back on that Christmas period, it does seem odd now. It's like almost exactly 2 weeks afterwards, we're starting to see these big spikes, and it's like, oh, yeah, maybe that was a bad idea. Yes, we'll keep going, see how it goes in the future. And yeah, the only piece of advice I can give you is if you need to go to a vaccination centre, don't follow the map that was on BBC News the other day, because you might find yourself going to Bristol and ending up in Wales.
Or going to Manchester and ending up in the sea.
Yep.
Yes, quite an impressive map fail. I'll try and throw that in the show notes there. Discuss that with a few geographers who understand what went wrong, but it's one of those problems where it's like someone who didn't necessarily know how to explain things to other people did something. So it's like you can understand why the setting was used, except it looks really bad in hindsight. So moving on into our main story tonight. I mean, if you expect it to be anything else, I don't know what rock you've been living under. I think we're going to have to move on straight to our story about the US Capitol being stormed by, a pro-Trump mob or far-right extremists. I think there was a lot of discussion on the night about what term should be used for these people. A lot of semantics going back and forth. I think that was partly people trying to cope with such shocking scenes, really.
Yeah, it was crazy. I wanted to start on what, like, the day that it should have been, because I very rarely watch US media, like news and stuff. But it was about tea time, and I found that there was a live stream going on of CBS. It was on YouTube. So I popped that on, and I was like, right, today is the day that Congress is meant to approve the Electoral College votes. Happens every January.
I was going to say, would it be safe to say this was supposed to be a very boring and procedural day where we all decided we didn't like Mitch McConnell a bit more than normal?
Basically, yeah. Like the reason I would watch it, a very boring person, is because I wanted to. I know a lot about like UK parliamentary procedure, but watching US Congress procedure is something I know very little about, and getting a feel of like, oh, that's how the House operates, that's how the Senate operates. You got some pretty like I looked forward to seeing what the process was. So essentially they go state by state in alphabetical order. Somebody comes up and says, oh, by the way, the state of Alaska awards so many votes to Donald Trump in the presidential election. Does anybody object? Nobody objects. Mike Pence says, all things being right, that we'll approve of that, move on. So they go through an alphabetical order, and then they got to Arizona, which is one of those first swing states, disputed states, one of those ones that one of those 5 states that Trump would have said that, there were discrepancies here and issues of voter fraud. As we know, as we have repeatedly said on this podcast, I hope, and as everybody, in the media has said, the evidence of vote fraud is little to none, and of 60 court cases brought up in the US, I think Trump's campaign has only succeeded on 1 count. All the 59 have been thrown out, and that's everything from suggesting that votes were shredded to voting machines being rigged in some way. I want to make it very clear that these are objectively false things that the Trump campaign and certain Republicans have been saying. But anyway, there is this rhetoric going on in the Republican Party, which meant that when Arizona came up, somebody from the Republican Party said, yes, we would like to object to these results. So then, from my understanding, the whole procedure stops. The House says, right, we've got to stop confirming these votes. We'll go away and we'll have a debate about these votes. And then we'll come back and we'll approve, and we'll have a vote on whether we approve of them or not. So Congress had just split up, and they'd started to do their big speeches, both in the House and in the Senate. And my focus was on the Senate, because that's what the news was covering. And I got to see some really impassioned speeches from both sides, from Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, who are the leaders of their political parties in the Senate, respectively. It was really interesting, actually, to see Mitch McConnell say, look, I know it's hard to take, but we lost this. We lost this election. We should accept it and move on. And the Democrats basically saying, yeah, you did lose. And then Ted Cruz would come up and say, actually, I think he was one of a group of 10 senators. He came up and said, actually, we should dispute this result because back in 1876, I might get that date wrong, it's 18-something-6, we disputed the results last time, blah-de-blah-de-blah. The American people deserve to know that we are willing to investigate this. And everybody basically said, nah. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting lost in the...
No, I mean, I appreciate it. It was probably... Mitch McConnell gets a lot of flack because as the majority leader of the Senate, he has been blocking a lot of things Democrats would want. And obviously, I don't think it was surprising to find that I tend to know more Democrats on the internet than I know Republicans. But it's definitely, you see him getting a lot of flack because he is that person who's always blocking things. It's up to him what bills get to the Senate floor. So he just won't bring things he doesn't want. This is one of the benefits of controlling the Senate. So it was actually quite interesting to see him giving that speech. And I think the important quote there was, the voters, the courts, and the states have spoken. If we overrule them, it would damage our republic forever. Which is like, because during all those electoral shenanigans that Trump was alleging, all during that time, McConnell was saying, yeah, no, we should let the judicial process go, etc., which is actually, it's not a terrible position. It's kind of like, the problem is that it was also stoking the flames of the president. Like, the idea that you should allow the judicial process to work out, I don't think is a controversial one. It's just in that particular context, it became a very bipartisan issue. Seeing him give that was quite, it was like, oh, okay, yeah, in there that I know that people always, say about people on the other side horrible things, but you can see that he is a politician who understands, at the end of the day, he's going to accept the result, which is what any good politician should do, right?
Yeah, he accepts traditional norms of government, and, particularly an important thing about democracy is that the loser accepts defeat. Like, that is very essential for any democracy to work, that the loser accepts that the results are legitimate and moves on. Because if you don't, that's how you end up having coups in other countries where democracy is sort of disputed. You could point to several coups in Africa, for example, where election results are disputed and another side rises up or takes control of the military, blah, blah, blah. That's what happens when the rule of law and democracy is not respected. America prides itself on being the home of liberty, the home of democracy. So in order for them to in order for America to maintain that status, Mitch McConnell is saying we need to accept these election results and move on. It's also important to maybe point out that on this day as well, I forget if we mentioned it in our predictions podcast, but I think when I was talking about the remaining elections that were to happen in America, we had 2 Senate runoffs happening in Georgia. Georgia had been an incredibly close state in the election, just swung to Biden. But all in all, we'd said in our election coverage that although Biden did well for the Democrats in the presidential race, actually in the Senate and in the House, Democrats had underperformed, and they'd lost seats based on the 2018 congressional elections. And in the Senate, it looked like they would once again fall short of having 50 senators, what they needed to control the House. However, in Georgia that morning, both senators that ran for Georgia, that ran for the Democratic campaign, were predicted to win by slim margins, but still win. That was a huge win for those Democrats, because you're talking about 2 non-incumbent Democrats, one a former black pastor. There'd never been a black member of the Senate elected in Georgia. Another one was a 33-year-old Jewish former documentary filmmaker. Like, traditionally, you look at these candidates and think they wouldn't really stand a chance against entrenched incumbents in what is traditionally seen as a lean red state in America. The fact that they'd just lost the Senate as well might have influenced Mitch McConnell to say, hey, we need to not only accept these election results, but maybe we need to move on from Trump. because although Trump has been able to big up his success a lot, when you're actually looking at the facts of what he's been able to do since 2016, Trump had a Republican Party that won the presidency, the Senate, and the House back in 2016. In 2020, he's lost all three. And to do that within 4 years is quite impressive. So anyway, maybe get away from the point of that day, but this day was meant to draw a line under everything. Once it's confirmed, that's it. There's no coming back once those electoral college votes have been confirmed. This was meant to be Biden's day in the sun. He's confirmed as president of the United States. We've only, we'll all look at our watches and say, look, we've only got 2 weeks left of Trump. He can't do that much damage in this time, right?
How wrong we were.
We'll just get on with our day. But
very much, I'm sure we would have managed to spin a good hour and a half talking out of the events of that day, talking about procedure and how Georgia had just narrowly won the Senate and how that means it's now Minority Leader Mitch McConnell because of how the Senate at 50-50, the tie vote is vice president, which, because that's going to be Kamala Harris, means essentially, while it is the narrowest majority you could possibly have with having to win tie votes, it is, as you say, quite a feat. It is, I can't remember how long it has been, but it's very rare. It's very rare for a president to not only lose after one term, but also lose both houses in one term. And I think it's only happened like twice ever. It's one of those things where it's so rare that it is impressive to see, even if it is, there's going to have to be stuff across the aisle. You're going to have to be more bipartisan and work with others. But we would have probably spent a good amount of time focusing on that and how Biden, as someone who's been in the government before, is very good at working with people over the other side of the aisle. He's worked with Mitch McConnell before. We could have spent a long time on that. I just want to summarize those points so people are aware that we're aware of them. But obviously that all kind of got blown out of the water. So do we want to go through kind of the events that started to unfold? Because we were watching that. I don't think I was even watching the TV at this point. I think I'd seen a few clips coming through, like I saw the Mitch McConnell one shared on Twitter. But I wasn't watching a stream myself. But things started to change at that time.
So we were watching the stream, and there was a Republican senator who just started his speech, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Vice President Pence bangs his gavel or whatever they do in the Senate, and suddenly said, "Hold up, we've got to take a recess," and everything shuts down, and you see some people who look like Secret Service officers come in and whip Vice President Pence away. So my instinct was like, is there been a threat to Pence or something, or is he is he I don't know, has there been a threat been made against him? Because earlier in the day, you've had a big march outside the Capitol, like a Stop the Steal march, organized by a Facebook group that wasn't attached to the Republican Party officially. But of course, a lot of Republicans then sort of endorsed, and Donald Trump himself encouraged his supporters to come and march on the Capitol on January 6th. And he gave a big speech to his supporters before then, basically saying, he played the hits. So he said, like, oh, how the election's rigged, all of this jazz. And he also seemed to claim that he hoped that Mike Pence did his job today, which seemed to suggest that Mike Pence could in some way stop the results of this election being approved. Because basically he is the official guy who approves the votes. But it must be stressed that he's also just like, I don't know how to put it. He's like the Queen in English politics. You know how the Queen gets laws and she approves them? Like, maybe technically she could disapprove of a law when it came to her desk, but she's not going to do that because the whole fabric of the way that Parliament works would crumble if she decided to do that, or if she asserted her power, she'd be thrown out the minute that she did. And Mike Pence is in that similar position. He actually has very little to no power to stop that from happening. And when it was made very clear to Trump, I think even Mike Pence gave a letter to Trump saying that, by the way, just so you know, I won't be doing any shenanigans today. I won't be overturning it. This mob outside kind of saw it as the last resort of somebody on the inside, for them to try and stop this result going through. So then they decided to take matters into their own hands and started to apparently storm the Capitol and invade the Congress building. And I don't know if this is where you started to see some of the the footage come in of what was happening?
Well, so I was online on Discord, as I often am, and I was busy getting on with work, and just had things going on down the side. I had Twitter vaguely open, and I was paying attention to a politics channel on a server I helped moderate when it went from kind of, as you say, boring routine Twitter stuff being shared, people complaining about Mitch McConnell and Pence and all the kind of normal stuff I expected, to I think I saw that clip of the gavel being banged, and I was like, oh, what's going on? And then there was talk of, people started sharing various tweets about there's something going on at the Capitol. I went onto Twitter, things were trending, and it was very much, there are various events that happen, right, in your life where you're like, oh, I'm going to remember that, where I was, and boringly, I was sat in front of my computer. But, I don't think there's been an equivalent event that's captured the entire internet's attention in quite that way in a long time. And I ended up getting PBS up because they have a live stream to YouTube. I didn't know you could get CBS over here. I just assumed I could only get PBS because it's their public service channel. Also, it doesn't have many adverts for an American channel, which is a good thing, because it's really weird and jarring having American adverts in the middle of news like that happening. But yeah, they just started showing all these streams of everything that was going on, and it very much looked like protesters just kind of walked in, was essentially how it looked at that point. But then suddenly things took a turn for the worse.
Yeah, so the reports of, there started to be footage coming in of not protesters walking in, but I don't know if you saw that one of people sort of banging against a door as they were coming in, sort of like with a fire extinguisher or something as they started to move in.
I think I saw about concurrently, I saw one which was like from the inside of a locked door being banged on from outside.
Yeah, that's the one.
So like the people inside going, oh, they're banging, but it was still that kind of like, oh, a protest gone a bit awry, it's fine. And then the other one I saw around that time was a video, or at least so hard to keep track of this, but I'm pretty certain another thing I saw around that time was a video of police kind of Capitol Police letting protesters in, where they're like banging on what looks like fencing or something, and it's hard to tell from the video exactly what happened because you kind of see it, you come in the middle of it, but it looks like very much like police letting people into the Capitol and people saying, oh, they've just let them in kind of thing. And you're like, oh, what's going on here then? But it wasn't much later that we saw other doors being broken into, and it got a lot worse. It suddenly turned up a notch.
Yeah, I think it's worth bringing up now. I'm maybe going to save that till later, but I think that footage of the police letting them in obviously made it look quite jarring for a number of reasons. One, were police understaffed? Were police felt so threatened that they couldn't combat these protesters coming in? And kind of secondly, and the bigger point was that how on earth did this mob of people, how were they allowed to get so close to the Capitol building? If they're banging on the doors, then clearly they've got too close, because if you cast your mind back to the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening over the summer, there were pictures of federal troops in combat gear lining the steps. Like, you wouldn't have been able to get within 500 meters of that place back in the summer. And, if you think of what Trump did to get to his church for his photo op, he tear-gassed peaceful protesters outside to get there. There was no signs of such force being used against these protesters that were actively trying to enter a congressional building that was doing a very important hearing. So that was mad, and that sort of, I think that tied into the narrative of why is the police acting this way with this right-wing, mainly white mob that is fighting for, trying to overturn a legal democratic process, when they acted far more heavy-handedly against the Black Lives Matter protesters, who were merely sort of just requesting equal civil rights and maybe, ironically, less brutal police tactics to be used against people of color. Like, that was, I think, realizing that this mob had been able to infiltrate the Congress so easily was scary in itself, and made you think, why had this been allowed to happen by the police staff that were there? And maybe the next question was, why aren't federal troops swooping in from somewhere? You would expect, because the siege of Congress appeared to go on for, I was glued to it for hours. It seemed like a long while until anybody really swept in and started dealing with these protesters in a manner that seemed fitting. Like, it seemed hours before they started to tear gas people and get them away from that back wall, that one entrance to the White House. It was bizarre and really scary watching it.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it was a shock to watch. In our show notes, you'll see I've basically posted a load of Twitter links, which is roughly the feed that I followed on that day. Because, as I say, I was on Discord, I was able to scroll up and go through the links I saw roughly as I saw them, here and there. And I did try to grab stuff as it happened. But yeah, so it went quickly from that banging on the door tweet, which is a video, to a series of really good quality photos, because obviously they have people like Getty Images there and other people taking photos because it's Congress. A really good set of photos, and it's like, oh, they've breached the Capitol, and there's just some protesters standing around in a lobby. They're kind of enjoying having photos taken of them. It's a bit weird. And later on, as you said, tear gas was used in that corridor, and you see a photo of that corridor with people being dispersed by tear gas. And then I think it was actually quite quick in the series of links I've grabbed together that it was something like the 9th tweet I've got in this list. I'm not going to put them all in the show notes. There's too many. But they're in the chamber. One is up on the dais yelling, "Trump won the election. This is insane," was the quote. And that's got a really good photo. You know how they say the revolution will be televised? Well, instead, the insurrection was televised. It was surreal and scary to watch, because I think it was amazing how quickly things happened. And as you say, just no response, it would seem. And I remember there was a fair amount of back and forth on Twitter about, were the National Guard coming in? Oh no, yeah, the National Guard are definitely coming in. Oh no, they've been stood down. Do you want to bring in the National Guard because they're under Trump's control? And it was this whole back and forth. And then I believe the National Guard did eventually turn up, but it was obviously not quickly, which is, as you say, stark contrast to the Black Lives Matter protests, where they were there protecting, I think it's the Lincoln Memorial is the particular photo that everyone was sharing, like ahead of those protests, which, as we know, were peaceful protests, not as an insurrection.
These people storming Congress, they were storming it in like full combat gear, some of them. And we know that after the event, 2 bombs were removed from Congress as well.
Yes, so a device was found, interestingly, because I remember that coming through, and some people were saying, oh, it's not really being covered, but it came up in the middle of that PBS broadcast. They're like, they found a device at the RNC, which, let's note, is the Republican head office, and that had been dealt with, and then another one was found near the Democrats as well. So it did kind of feel like, it was weird, because it felt like there wasn't really a plan, because there were these people kind of wandering around like a protest gone wrong. But then there was obviously some planning if someone managed to get devices together and take them to both the RNC and the Democrats. But it was just kind of, all of that kind of flashed past so quickly, and it's now everyone's kind of been picking it apart in the days following.
Yeah, there was a weird juxtaposition at the time, I felt, of pictures of what essentially is these goofballs in Congress of like, oh, look at that guy, he looks like Jamiroquai, he was like the Q shaman or whatever. He's funny to look at. Or look at that guy who some people mistakenly called via Getty, but they got it wrong because that was just who took the picture. The guy holding the podium and smiling. Like that is blatant what they're doing. They shouldn't be there, but it kind of looks like just some goofballs walked in and decided they could take whatever they wanted. But on the other hand, you had very serious scenes of the congressmen and women being barricaded inside the House of Representatives, and shots being fired, shots that led to one woman amongst the protesters, sadly losing her life. So there was, and we have had other pictures of a man who was in the House of Representatives after all the congressmen and women had been cleared, with these, they look like zip ties, but they're actually like these plastic cuffs that are used by the police, that seemed to suggest that he was a mass protester looking for people to like kidnap or, do something with. You had people defacing Nancy Pelosi's office, going on a computer. There's a picture of that man with his feet up on her desk, and that's an incredibly like personal place for Nancy Pelosi. Like you feel particularly violated by that happening. You've got a whole spectrum of things here, ranging from not very serious to extremely serious, but the fact is these people should have never been allowed in the building in the first place. So you've even got the there were reports that, you had 5 people died as a result of this mob. One of them was the woman who was shot. 3 of them were for health-related issues amongst the Trump protesters, and one of them was a police officer who died defending the Capitol. I think he was hit in the head with a fire extinguisher. So, yeah, it was an incredibly sort of serious situation, events of which have only really come out now we look to, now the dust has settled, we can work out what's going on. But it certainly was a chaotic scene, and I just remember the newscasters, everybody on the news being shocked at what they were seeing and being incredibly disheartened that this had been allowed to happen. The big question I think that they were trying to reflect on, and maybe one will try and explain, is how had America allowed itself to get to this point?
I think people, were kind of like, oh well, we've managed, Biden has won. There's going to be this kind of, sensible handover of power in Congress. It's a bit like this idea that, now we've got the vaccine, well, coronavirus is over. It's not like the problems that got America here are still present in American society. They don't just suddenly go away because you have a vote. And I think we've said stuff along that line before, but I think this is kind of a very clear indication of how troubled American society is in certain ways, and how, obviously this is a radical group. It's a few hundred people. It's not hundreds of thousands of people, but you've let it get to this state that many people could gather, get there, not be caught out ahead of time. That there's stuff going around, and I don't want to speculate anything because obviously it will come out in due time. But there was definitely, as you say, there's the guy who had the plastic handcuffs and stuff. So it seems like amongst the kind of general rabble, there were people who had a certain plan. I don't want to say too much on that until stuff comes out from the authorities and stuff. I've seen people speculating and talking about it on the internet and trying to track them down. Obviously, they're making the FBI's job very easy by posting it all on Twitter. And I have also posted a link there about Parler, which, as you know, is kind of it's a platform a bit like Twitter that we would maybe discuss a bit further on in this episode, but generally attracted the free speech kind of right-wing crowd in the US. And they had a hacker went on their website and basically managed to get a load of metadata about users. And there's a GPS map kind of showing how people got into the Capitol there, which I've only just seen that article. That's quite interesting. But yeah, it's a mixture of, I think kind of it left you a bit dazed. Not only was it a shock, but then, as you say, there were moments of levity and stupidity amongst moments that were very serious. I think it's now been deleted, actually. I had a link to a tweet where they're saying, shots have been fired. And we think that was actually the shot that was fired against the protester that killed her, unfortunately. Obviously, don't want anyone to die. That tweet has since been removed because I think it was phrased as oh God, they're shooting into the building kind of thing. It was a misunderstanding of what was going on because it was actually the Capitol being defended. But yeah, it was manic. Very hard to understand everything that was going on. A lot of having to deal with people being very worried all over the place, and trying to be look, we don't know a lot of stuff that's going on. It's coming through in dibs and drabs. And as you say, fortunately, it was okay. Obviously, all the Congress people were evacuated. Sorry, I feel I'm rambling a bit here.
No, it's all right. So it's a hard event to comprehend, and it was chaotic.
A lot happened. Yeah. A lot happened in a very short period of time, and I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was worried for my own safety. I don't live in America, but just because it was very difficult at the time, and it kind of still is in retrospect to parse everything that happened. So I've got a good link about how the Capitol was stormed from NYT that I'll put in the show notes. So, if there's anything we've missed, it'll be in there. It was just, it still kind of feels very visceral, even though it was last week. It's not something I'll forget being online for as it kind of unfurled.
I would just quickly add to that New York Times article very quickly. There was an ITV reporter who got in with the protesters as well. I believe he shared a 7-minute clip on Twitter. There's also a show going out, I think, in 5 minutes tonight. So that should be on ITV that has lots of footage from within the Capitol as he sort of mingled with protesters. And he may say that he's got a slightly privileged position because if you're a member of the US media, like for CNN, I think it would have been quite hard to have mingled with those protesters in the same way that a British media person was able to get in and get those shots. But if you want an insight into what was happening in the capital, I'd suggest watching that.
So we've kind of talked about what happened. As we say, it was confusing, manic, a lot going on, and we maybe haven't fully let it all sink in yet, even a week after the event. But I suppose we should touch on how we got here, as in why did this happen specifically? Like I've mentioned Parler, I've mentioned a few things here and there as we've been going on, but what are the kind of, I mean, I know most people know the basics, but what do you want to dive into on like what got us to this moment with the kind of Trump fanatics?
Yeah, so I think there's a what and there's a who. The who is clearly Donald J. Trump, and the what is that he's been allowed to perpetuate this myth of voter fraud for too long, and it's been humoured by members of the Republican Party for far too long as well. So we were kind of applauding Mitch McConnell for standing up in the Senate earlier and saying, yeah, it's time to accept the result. He kind of only did that on January 6th. Up until then, there were many members of the Republican Party who had been slow to or had outright, refused to, call Biden the president-elect or respect the result in that way. And the reason they are doing that is I don't think it's because deep down inside they believe the result was rigged. They clearly don't, because Mitch McConnell was able to flip on January 6th and say, no, I don't believe that. The reason they follow it is because they know President Trump obviously has a very big sway amongst a large proportion of voters. And Trump's line is that the election was rigged. And he's been allowed to say it again and again and again. And particularly, we know amongst a lot of the Trump fanatic supporters, literally the only person that they believe is Donald J. Trump. If he says it, they'll believe him. They can't be swayed by any facts, any media. That's it. That's a very small proportion of Trump supporters, I believe. But I believe there was some polling done after the events that happened in the Capitol, and I think it was something like 45% of registered Republican voters felt that what happened in the Capitol was kind of fine or kind of justified, which is madness to me. I think that they would go along with that. So that goes to show that the problem is much deeper, and it's been allowed to go ahead because you've got somebody right at the top of the party who is just repeating this lie over and over again. And maybe what's more worrying about that, and why I put the blame at the door of Donald Trump the most, is because he had many opportunities to let this simmer down, to stop it. If Trump came out and said, I concede, then these people would have believed him, because that's who they believe. That's who they've put all their faith in. His refusal to concede whipped up this hatred and this anger against Congress. And then, as the riot was happening, there was silence from Donald Trump, so much that it was frustrating. We had President-elect Biden on TV give an address before Trump did, and he essentially called Trump out and said, look, we're looking for leadership here. Our capital is literally under siege. You should come out and say something. And when Trump did come out and say something, it was a pre-recorded video released only on Twitter that, although it said, hey guys, you got to stop the violence, it also said this election is still rigged. And at the end, it was like, I love you, or something. We like you very much.
I think he also called them very special.
Very special. That was it. Yeah, very special. Why would you say that to people who are raiding your nation's Congress, one of your seats of democracy? It's just beyond the pale. So that is why I think that we've certainly seen in recent days this big sort of swing to people suddenly going, I lay the blame firmly at Donald Trump's door. And there are many of us who would say, look, we could have seen it coming, or the signs were there. I think it's very hard to have a degree of sympathy with people who go, oh, I know Trump's bad, but I didn't think he would actually be that mad and do it. But certainly looking back, it's hard not to see that all the signs were there. Even when he won back in 2016, he was claiming voter fraud meant that he had a less big victory than he should have had. And he just seems, his inability to follow democratic norms and his need for sort of power and popularism and over everything else, I think, is what has led us to this moment. I don't know if you have anything to add or anything else that you think is to blame for this movement, but I think Trump is certainly at the heart of it.
Trump is someone who has made use of a lot of things that were already happening in society. Social media bubbles, things like that, are problems that we need to address. It's not, we can't lay everything at the feet of Trump. And I think that's what I was kind of trying to say about how, people were like, oh, well, we've had the vote, Trump's going away, we can look forward to things being better. And we said similar things, and this hope that Biden will help heal the country. What this event has shown is that there's a lot more work to be done than maybe anyone suspected. But it's a lot of things, and I think a thing that's going to be interesting is, I think it's Section 230 in the United States that is the law that means that like Facebook, etc., aren't held to editorial standards, because they're essentially like a public forum, I suppose. I can't remember the exact term for this protection, but they're protected. Basically means they don't have to. You can't sue Facebook for something someone posts on Facebook. Is the short end of the short summary of this. And people are talking about changing that. And I don't think. I mean, Facebook, etc., would disappear if you were able to sue them for anything anyone posted on their platform. So I don't think it would ever go quite that far. But it's an interesting debate that's going on in the US at the moment related to that. We have similar issues over here. We've talked about Cambridge Analytica and stuff in the past with Brexit. So yeah, there is definitely a polarization going on in politics. I mean, you can see it, people being stuck in echo chambers. There is, again, it's one of these. It's a very hard line to walk, and I know we try. We're not shy about being liberal people and not being right wing on this show, but we try and analyze, I think, things in the middle. And I'm not saying we're the best people ever or anything like that, but I think there is definitely a lot of stuff where you can get very siloed into a particular way of thinking. Like you see people saying, well, I can't possibly talk to this person because they said this one thing, and it's like it's very easy to say make a mistake, So there's stuff going both ways where both groups kind of shout each other out, who shouts the loudest about different things. And Twitter is this kind of weird melting pot where you get both groups kind of shouting at each other but not really listening. There's definitely issues going on there. I'm not really sure if I've got a fully formed point on this yet, but I definitely think I would like to see less polarization of people in general. I think something in the middle is how you get. It's kind of this problem. I think we've talked about this with two-party systems before, where kind of you want your party to get in, so your party can undo some of the stuff the other party has done and put in your set of reforms, whatever that is. So if you vote for the progressive candidate, you want the progressive reforms, and if you vote for the conservative candidate, you want them to undo those things and put in stricter rules that you agree with. Is the kind of the vague idea, and I think it would be a lot better for us if we went back to a kind of more centrist period of time where people say, oh, nothing happens when you have a centrist government, and my feeling is, yes, it could be slow in certain ways, but I'd rather it's kind of a hard argument to make, right? Because if you've been stuck, say, as we have in the UK with a conservative government for a long period of time, you're like, well, you feel the pendulum should swing the other way, but if the pendulum keeps swinging further and further, then it's going to be more and more extreme as you go back and forth. And that's essentially how polarization in a two-party system works. And I think it would be nice to have, as we've discussed on other episodes, proportional representation, which means that more people are represented, and hopefully people would be less angry that they aren't being represented, and it would lead to less polarization. And I don't know what the US plan is to address this. I don't think many people have been talking about solutions right now. So I tried to throw a few in there, I suppose. They're not fully formed thoughts. So yeah, if people have things they want to talk about, maybe it's a thing we could do in a deep dive at some point into kind of different ways that polarization has been combated in other countries. But it's just kind of a hard period of time to be in, knowing there's a problem but not having the solution.
Yeah, definitely. It's 2021. Who knew? Who knew it could start off with such, who knew it could be worse than 2020 already? But here we are.
As someone said last week, oh, it's been quite a year, yeah? Yeah, it's only 6 days. Me trying to solve the world by just thinking out loud on air is not going to happen. So maybe we should move into the consequences that have come from this with Trump already. That I mentioned Parler, which, as I say, was this kind of a right-wing app. That's not Trump specifically, but that app itself has been essentially taken down because AWS, that's Amazon Web Services, which if you don't know, that Amazon, in addition to doing selling everything to everyone, also owns like half the internet by being the backbone of all these websites. Now you do. But they basically said because Parler was being used to basically they allow all any speech on there. They don't moderate at all. So AWS said under our terms and conditions, violence was being incited, as we saw. So bye, there goes your service. Not only was the app being removed from app stores and stuff like that, but the service itself has just been turned off because Amazon said you're not allowed your account anymore. And that is not a Trump-specific thing, but yes, a lot has happened in the last week in the tech sector specifically. And what happened with Trump's social media?
Yeah, so in reaction to that video he posted, which was sort of a cry for rioters to go home, but not really, Twitter quickly banned the video and said that it was inciting violence, and as a result locked Trump out of his Twitter account for 24 hours, which is kind of a big deal because Trump is somebody who clearly has used Twitter in the past to get around traditional forms of getting his message out in the media. The way I look at it as Trump doesn't like to be scrutinized. So Trump could call a press conference at any time and do it that way, but he'd kind of have to engage with the traditional media outlets to do that in a sense, and he really doesn't want to do that. The last thing he wanted to be doing was taking questions at that time. Compare that to what Biden had done. Biden had a national television address, invited members of the media there, and some members of the media, even though it was a very sort of like one-sided address to the nation, some members of the media shouted out to Biden at the end, kind of saying, I think they asked him a question of like, oh, what's your security fears for the inauguration? And Biden actually stopped his walk off the set, turned around and said, oi, look, I've got no fears for my security at the inauguration. That will go ahead. So that shows you that Biden's approach is very different to Trump's, who will always use Twitter to bypass that and get his direct message across to his supporters. So cut off from that method of communication, he's a bit lost. How does he get his message out? 24 hours later, after the ban could be lifted, but that would require Trump to delete the offending messages, which he doesn't do. And then in kind of a unilateral action taken by both Twitter and Facebook, they ban Trump from their platforms. And as a result, lots of other tech firms follow suit. So there was a raft of social media sites Trump was banned from, ranging from Facebook to Twitter to Instagram to TikTok to even Pinterest. So I don't know, Trump can't look up mood designs for his gold curtains anymore.
The jokes on this particular one have been the best because I mean, Twitter, Facebook, as you say, came out first, then Twitter essentially banned him. And you got like, oh, his Pinterest. It's like, oh, I'm so terrible. He won't be able to look at mood boards of curtains and gold furnishings. And that was kind of funny. And then someone's like, oh, and he's also been removed from Snapchat. And I was like, he had a Snapchat? Like, next you're going to say he had a TikTok and he was twerking and I didn't know about it.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it is mad, but that narrowed his options down. And of course, the one that everybody thought he might go and join is Parler, because tends to be a more right-wing leading social media platform. That's where a lot of people who've been banned from Twitter end up going. Former residents include Graham Linehan, also known bad person. And so I think that's why Amazon then moved quickly to say, no, we're limiting what you can put on there because we host your servers. And then that got taken away as well. So there's a lot of people on the right now arguing about free speech and how that's been impacted. The response on the left has been, well, to bring up an old right-wing example of the bakers who can refuse to make a gay marriage cake. Equally, social media sites can refuse to have extreme violent opinions on their website. It's not breaking freedom of speech amendment because they are a private company. Therefore, they can legislate and decide who's let into that company.
Which is exactly where this argument about like Section 230 and stuff has been coming up as well. Like people, again, I'll point you to other podcasts in the show notes where they discuss this at length and with better knowledge than I. But yeah, back and forth about, where there is this general desire for people to shout free speech to mean I can say anything, which is not the case under the US definition of free speech, and definitely isn't the case in other countries. So there's this whole mixing up of what people think is a constitutional. I mean, don't get me wrong, free speech is a constitutional right, but it's not like incitement to violence and stuff like that is not free speech. That there's not much nuance there. It's quite two distinct things, and people say, "Oh, free speech means free speech," like without actually knowing what free speech means a lot of the time. As you say, private companies can do what they like. It's their service. In the same way, Parler could just be like, "We're not going to do anything about it." But then AWS, a private company, can say, "You're not allowed on our service anymore because you've breached our terms and conditions that we set."
Yeah, precisely. So, I mean, it has raised some big questions about. It's amazing how quickly this happened and how much big tech can suddenly shut a very influential person out of their entire sort of like organization just like that. Many people have been arguing for Trump to be thrown off Twitter before because of tweets that he's done in the past that you could easily say have, incited violence in a way or had the possibility to do so. I think the difference with this one is that it was very clear that there was a causational link between what Trump had tweeted and the actions in the Capitol building. So they had a bit more of a, they could stand up like that. And equally, Trump has lost. Trump won't be president after the 20th of January. So there's like less of a consequence to doing that. If they'd banned him in 2018 and he had 2 years to go, we might see a bit more of a struggle against that. But I think a lot of people are accepting that the POTUS account will be handed over. Donald Trump, I don't need to listen to Donald Trump's tweets in the same way that I did when he was president. You know what I mean? Because tweeting had become such an important aspect of Trump's policy positions in some aspects. People had been, it appeared that some policies had been made because Trump had tweeted them, and officials within the White House had to scramble to get something together to present to the media because this was the president's viewpoint on it. So, I think there's a lot of reasons why social media has acted in that way. We're also seeing a bit more backlash from businesses now. There was, we're seeing certain businesses, I think Hallmark was the one I picked up on, but there are others who are withdrawing funding for Republican Party candidates and the Republican Party in general as a reaction to this. Trump's bank, Deutsche
I was
Bank.
going to say, yeah, that's the one. That was the big one I heard, because doesn't he owe them millions of dollars that they've been kind of letting him off for the last how many years? So if they pull their support, he owed them like 40 million essentially. Yeah, so he owes them millions of dollars, and if they're withdrawing their support, that means the bailiffs might come a knocking.
Yeah, so obviously not good news for Trump there. There's even some like news from the world of sport, which I've been keeping up with. So there's two big bits. One of the Trump international courses was meant to be used for the PGA Golf Tour in 2022. They've now withdrawn that from the calendar and said they'll now look for an alternative venue to host that. And then there was an NFL coach who was meant to be presented with the Presidential Freedom Medal, which is one of the big awards that the president can give out. And, particularly end of term, he can give it to anybody he wants. This NFL coach turned it down, basically saying the events of the recent days have made me think that, hey, maybe I shouldn't accept this award. Which kind of shows, it's bizarre for me to say this now, but Trump was toxic before, but he's particularly toxic now to the extent that lots of businesses and people are doing everything possible not to be associated with him. Whereas before they could kind of get away with it, or at least they think like 75 million Americans agree with me, our country is pretty split, but I feel I can walk some sort of middle ground with this guy if I don't get involved in the politics side of it. If I'm just picking up an award from him, that's okay. Now everybody doesn't seem to want to touch Donald Trump at all. So I think he's seen a big impact from it. The thing I really want to see is, he may have already done it, but today is meant to be one of the first times Trump is appearing in public down at the border wall to talk about some of his successes as a president, some of his accomplishments. but it'll be the first time he's had to address the media in such way. So it'll be really interesting to see how he addresses them. Is he a bit more combative? Is he the fighty Trump? Is he auto cue Trump, which tends to be a bit more reserved and official? Or will he just be low energy Trump, which is kind of, he knows it's over. I'd be really interested to see how he addresses the media now that all of this stuff has happened in the past 6 days.
Yeah. I mean, he was like, blah, 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 let me roll back. Yeah, I mean, I feel very much, again, I'm not watching US TV, so it may be different. If you're in the US, please let us know. But very much, I feel like he's kind of like just giving out missives via an aide and things like that. Like, he doesn't have Twitter, which used to be his way of saying things. So, like, there was a report, of course, that he's not going to be attending the inauguration. Things like that have come out. There was also a report from Scotland saying that he's not allowed to come and visit their golf courses to miss the inauguration, which I thought was quite funny. But yeah, there's I'm not sure I can imagine a contrite Trump.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. I don't think he's possible. He has to be auto cue Trump if he's doing that. That's the only time he's ever appeared presidential in the old sense of the word. Is when somebody has written those words for him. Left to his own devices, he can go off on one. And sorry, just to bring you brought up a very important point there, which is that Trump won't be attending the inauguration. That would have been the other thing we would have been talking about this week. In a normal world, that would have been the biggest thing. I actually had a regular listener to the podcast message me today saying that, do you remember when you did those predictions? And the maddest thing you could think Trump would do is not attend the inauguration. It's like, yeah, it's a bit different now. So, yeah, I don't think Trump's come out of this well. I think that's fair to say.
Yes, no, definitely not. And those are the consequences he's already seen. But I think there's also been a lot of talk about other consequences that could be, as we've talked before about impeachment this time last year, how time flies. There is talk about actual kind of official sanctions against him for his role in inciting these particular protesters. So I think there's two questions. I'll just lay them out now, and then you can attack them however you like. So what is the 25th Amendment for those of us in Britain who don't have the Constitution memorized? And can they impeach him? Do you think that's going to come through?
So just to address the first one, there are two methods to remove Trump. So either by the 25th Amendment or by impeachment. So the 25th Amendment is the one that the Democrats have been pursuing first because it's it's apparently far quicker to do. Because essentially the 25th Amendment says that if the president is deemed to be incapacitated or incapable of rule, the cabinet and the vice president essentially take a vote, say, yes, we agree that the president is unfit to rule. The vice president will rule in his place until either the president is fit again to rule, or the vice president will rule indefinitely if something else was happened to the president.
There's a very good, I know we've talked before about Legal Eagle, a very good YouTube video from Legal Eagle discussing all the ins and outs of the 25th Amendment that I'll throw in the show notes. But I think the key thing is that it's only really been used voluntarily by a president who's like undergoing elective surgery, for example, in the past, as opposed to being used to remove someone, which is this second part of the amendment that has just not ever had to be used in anger before.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. I think that's the reason why we need to really push the 25th Amendment one to the side and think that it's not going to happen. I think the Democrats had to pursue it because it's kind of a way of them. It's a way of them saying, look, we didn't get involved. If the cabinet and the vice president decide to get rid of Donald Trump in that manner, then that's all Republicans doing it, essentially. So it shows that that's a very quick unilateral move. Both sides don't dislike this president. He's gone. But the Republicans seem unwilling to do that. And like you said, the other reason they're unwilling to do it is because the 25th Amendment was never really used to remove a president that we think is unfit for office because we are worried about his decision-making in that sense, or because I don't think anybody would ever believe that the president would have encouraged a mob to attack the Capitol on his behalf. The 25th Amendment doesn't really fit into that. But the 25th Amendment is used more for like medical procedures, or if he's like, if the president had a stroke or suddenly was in a coma or something. It's kind of, it just tied up that loophole. If you actually want to get a president because you think he's unfit to rule, the correct way to go about that is impeachment. That's what it's there for. So that's the second way the Democrats are trying to remove Donald Trump. Obviously, he had one before. And when the idea of impeachment was initially put to me by, like, I had some friends texting me on the night just saying, like, oh, Democrats are saying they're going to impeach him. Can they do this? My initial reaction was like, nah, because the Ukraine impeachment, like, ran for 4 months. We've got 2 weeks. There's no way they can get it done that quickly. However, there are some key advantages to doing impeachment, and they can speed it up. So usually it can get stuck in committees for a long while. Democrats now control all those committees, and they've said, yeah, we can get a vote on the House really quickly on this. So they can speed up the process somewhat. You only need a simple majority in the House to pass impeachment in the lower chamber. The Democrats have that majority there as well, so it's really likely to pass. Then you move on to the Senate, that requires a 2/3 majority to remove the president. So with the Senate being as it is, you'd have to flip about 15 to 16 Republicans to try and remove Donald Trump. Is that possible? Do they have the numbers? I think that at the moment they could probably successfully flip about 5 senators, maybe the most notable of those being Mitt Romney, who's never liked the president and made it quite a public fact, and some of the more moderate Republican senators like Susan Collins. To get the other 10 on board, I'm not quite sure where they get the numbers at the moment. For some balance, I looked up I was looking at like, oh, how are Fox News covering the Capitol like riots and what that's doing? Because I think it's very interesting to see how they're approaching it and making it fit into their agenda. Some of the words that are coming out of the Republican side is, no, you can't impeach him. One, because he's going to be gone in a week anyway, so why bother? You're going to get rid of him. It's, we don't need to go through all this fuss. You seem to be like wanting to score one last political point. Secondly, and I think this is one of like the weakest arguments that they've got, is that, oh, if you impeach him, that might incite more violence. I think that's a really bad way to look at the situation. I've seen some people online compare it to like, I don't know if this is too extreme, but it's like people saying, if you've got like a domestic abuse situation, like, oh no, don't call the police on him. That's only going to make him angrier. You should keep it to yourself. And it's like, no, that's not how you deal with these type of people. You have to get in and remove them from the situation. What if Frodo said, no, I'm not going to destroy the ring because that will only divide Middle Earth further? It doesn't make sense in that aspect. So those are kind of the two arguments coming out of the Republican camp as to why not. And with all of these things, particularly with impeachment, it does kind of depend on what the Republicans think their base will do. If they think there's enough people in the Republican base who think that no, Trump really has to go, I think you can flip those 10 to 15 senators that they need to remove him.
There's a bit of information that's been coming in today. I know that these are both from the New York Times, so it's only a single source. But it's only a single newspaper, so it could be that this is being reported differently by other people, is what I mean. But there was earlier today they were saying that House Republicans are being told to not lobby against impeachment, so basically kind of let it go through. And there's also apparently McConnell, and again, this is not like a direct quote, but it's people familiar with the matter, pleased by the idea of impeachment because it's a way to kind of remove Trump from the Republican Party and have a clean break. Obviously, does that mean he will vote for impeachment? It remains to be seen. Mitch McConnell turning against Trump in a vote would surprise me, but at the same time, he's always been a shrewd politician. So maybe that's why Republicans might flip for this vote.
Yes, there's always the possibility, and I learned today that the impeachment process can run on after Biden is officially president. It doesn't. If they don't do it by the 12th, it doesn't stop. Impeachment not only removes Donald Trump from office, but also does a lot of other things, including, although it doesn't prevent him from running again in an election. If he is then impeached, the House can take a vote on if you stop him running for election again, and that only has to be passed by a simple majority. So it's very likely that Democrats could get that passed as well. He loses other rights as well, like some rights to a pension. He would still get Secret Service protection after he's gone. He is kind of a much more of a clean break from public life, and he won't be regarded in the same way as ex-presidents are. Like all the ex-presidents tend to turn up to things. You will see all the ex-presidents at the inauguration, probably, apart from Donald Trump, because they kind of it was what was it? I was looking this up, that there was an act kind of passed in the 1950s, 1960s that kind of said that no, America will look after its former presidents and make sure that none of them fall into poverty, which was kind of what happened with the earliest presidents. I think it was, I don't know if it was Jefferson. There's one of the older presidents who was kind of like hardly made any money after being president and was just kind of getting by on doing speeches for people. They try and make sure that they look after them, and you're a member of a very exclusive club of people, the very few people who have led one of the most influential countries in the world. You're meant to be looked after. To have Trump kind of kicked out of that club unceremoniously would kind of be the final embarrassment, I think.
It's kind of in stark contrast. I know we've talked recently about Tony Blair, Theresa May, and David Cameron coming back to say, and even John Major to say things about Brexit and other things, but it's generally kind of not the done thing in UK politics. I mean, Theresa May is still an MP, so it's a bit different for her, but whereas, yeah, it has always felt very different. But as you say, these laws haven't been around forever. In fact, one thing I was reading today was there was I think it was in 93 or 94, they changed, so the ex-presidents get a security detail for life. And then they changed it so that any presidents after 1994 would only get it for 10 years after their presidency. But then Obama reinstated it, so it is now again for life. So that, it was initially a cost-cutting measure that they put it down to 10 years. But obviously, if you have a controversial president, life could be at risk 10 years after they leave office still for, someone having a grudge against them. So you can understand why they do it. But equally, it's kind of interesting that's like, I don't imagine, I don't know off the top of my head, but I mean, I'm sure if they turn up to some kind of state function, there might be extra protection for an ex-prime minister, but I don't think they have any special protections under law that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it is. It's just very different to try and compare these two countries like chalk and cheese, where they do. But then again, we go through a lot more, I would say, or we can do. It's not as formal as our procedure. Like, you can have a very short-serving prime minister in Gordon Brown, or somebody like Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher who went on for over a decade. Or you can have Conservatives right now who have been in charge for 10 years but managed 3 different leaders. So, yeah, I think because of our less formal procedure, it means that it's harder to write those things in stone. But yeah, I think it's very embarrassing for Trump to be thrown out of that club. And if he was an outsider before, if he was ever looking when he started the presidency to kind of be accepted, or at least feel that he would be hanging around with those other people, that he would still be in the same company of, Bush, Clinton, Obama at those functions, he's kind of made it so it's almost impossible for him to turn up to those things. And with him refusing to turn up to the inauguration, maybe we can flip it back to that right at the end, it kind of shows that maybe his own refusal to do that maybe shows that he was never interested in being in that club in the first place. He's always been an outsider and will continue to be so, even after his presidency is long over.
I think one more thing I want to just ask before because this has been a long episode and we do need to wrap up, but what do you think the chances are? Like, Trump has this fervent base. How hard do you think it's going to be for Republicans to win back those people who've gone full Trump, as it were? Is there going to be like a split? Could Trump start the Trump party or something like that and split the right-wing vote in the US?
So I think those people who are fully down the rabbit hole, those people who were going to, you're talking about people who were going to bomb the RNC as well as the DNC when they marched on the Capitol.
Well,
these people,
I understand. I think there's probably that there is probably a gap between the people who did the actual protesting and storming and like people who didn't leave the house.
Yes, no, I think you're right in that aspect. The honest answer is we don't know. But my inclination, the fact that he went through the primaries as he did, with about like 20 to 30% of that fervent support in the Republican base that seemed to like him a lot, I think he will lose a significant amount of people who only turned up for Trump. Like, the reason Trump was able to challenge 4 presidencies in such massive numbers and encourage such big turnout was because he had that celebrity factor, that X appeal, that thing that he went above and beyond the Republican Party. And I don't think those people are going to go back to the Republican Party anytime soon if they disavow him. However, does that mean the Republicans are suddenly out of office for the next 10 years? That's a very different question. They're more likely to do it if Trump decides to set up his own political movement, because I think he will split the vote and you'll just see Democrats clearing up. Because Trump will only be able to pull 30 or 40%. There will still be some people who are diehard Republicans and will vote for the traditional party. The Democrats would be rubbing their hands with glee if that happened, to be frank. So, yeah, I think that's a possibility. But on the other hand, there is a strong argument to say that Trump was responsible for, like you say, losing the presidency, losing the House, losing the Senate. Republicans might want to get back to some normal government, campaigning on, the message that they went into Georgia with on the back of President Trump was these elections are sort of rigged and a bit dodgy. And there are some people suggesting that lowered turnout in key Republican counties, and that may have led to a Democrat win by such a narrow margin. If Trump can cost you that, then maybe you do want to get rid of him and start afresh so you can mount a more, traditional challenge to the Democrats, because the Republicans were still a very popular party without Trump. You've got to remember that in 2014, they won the House and Senate, took it away from Barack Obama in those midterms, without Trump ever even thinking of running for president. So there still exists that base. How much of that fervent Trump base goes with him, I think we will learn in the coming months, and certainly by the midterms in 2022. Look out for it. Set your watch. It's just around the corner. It's
going to be an interesting one, because obviously, as you normally, because it's normally 2 terms before a president, before it flips, you often get, like, Obama came in with quite a strong Democratic mandate at the start of his first term, but then at the second term, you start to get that drop off in the House and the Senate. So it'll be interesting to see if such a, like, can they capitalize on a narrowly won Senate this time round by putting through some good stuff, doing some good bipartisan stuff, and maybe winning over some Republicans in 2 years' time, or are they destined to lose control of the Senate in just 2 years?
Yeah, that we've got to wait and see. And I think a lot does come down to how Trump deals with his exit. If he does it gracefully, then the Republicans might stand a chance of getting back. If Trump completely disavows the Republican Party and goes on his own path, I think they're in trouble.
Well, watch this space. We'll be watching, and we'll be watching the polls in the future. There's obviously nothing to be paying attention to on that front right now. Thank you, as always, Rob, for helping explain the increasingly crazy world of US politics. And hopefully it can be a bit more normal, but I don't want to jinx it. So let's not say that. Yes, we've still got some time until the actual inauguration and stuff. So I think it's going to be a bit of a tense time in the US, obviously, following these events. Yeah, hopefully that all goes as smoothly as it can, given what's just happened. I know that there'll be lots more National Guard, deployed and stuff for the inauguration. So hopefully they've learnt their lesson from that kind of side of things, and it will be as peaceful as everyone was expecting. Thank you to all our listeners for joining us this week. Hope you enjoyed the slightly longer than usual episode. We will be back as usual in about 2 weeks' time. You can find us all over the place on the internet. Go to parliamentary.observer to get to our website, where you'll find links to all of our social media, etc. You can find us on YouTube, Facebook, etc. Come over there. As I always say, the most useful thing you can do if you like this podcast and want other people to hear it, tell your friends, they will go and download it and listen to us, and maybe they would like the podcast too. Of course, if you do have a few dollars to spare to send our way, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can give us money that will help go towards hosting costs. It will help go towards the equipment we use, software we have to pay for. And I think this week I'm going to have to pay for a Getty image of the Capitol. So, there's stuff like that we can support as well. And of course, it shows us that you like us, which is obviously great for our self-esteem. And you also get a bonus pre-show rambling. There seems to be a lot about Assassin's Creed Valhalla at the moment, but if you want to hear us chatting about stuff that's not necessarily politics, just about our lives and how things are going, maybe a bit more view into how the podcast gets made sometimes as well, that's there for you over on Patreon if you support us for at least $1 a month. And with that said, I don't think there's anything left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took the schoolyard conversation of which one of my favourite fictional characters would win in a fight? Well, wonder no more. Join me, Chris, and my co-host Matt every other Sunday for Mish Mayhem, and you can find out.